whetting our political appetite.
Can the SNP deliver Scottish independence? Will we ever build enough homes? And is there no money left? This is Politics Live. Joining me, Conservative MP and former Housing Secretary Sir Simon Clarke, Labour MP and Shadow Minister for Tech and Digital Alex Davis-Jones, Liberal Democrat MP Munira Wilson and Camilla Tominey, Associate Editor of The Daily Telegraph. Today.
Let us use the next general election to put independence front and centre.
SNP leader Humza Yousaf has a new plan for Scottish independence, but will it work? And is the party's conference being overshadowed by the previous leader?
You know that I think Humza's doing a fantastic job as leader of the party and as First Minister, and I don't think there's any doubt from what I've seen about who is in charge at this conference, and it's Humza Yousaf.
What we want to see is what I've called a property-owning democracy.
In the footsteps of Anthony Eden, who set as the goal of a property-owning democracy.
Our aim is to increase home ownership by 1 million.
Politicians like to make big promises about house building and home ownership, but will they ever be fulfilled?
If you want to intensify your trade relationship to European Union, call us.
The German government says a better Brexit deal is on offer. Should Rishi Sunak pick up the phone? And let's start with this warning, BBC News headline, which says no room for tax cuts or spending rises. The IFS think tank warns, and that's for this year and next year, the Institute for Fiscal Studies. So my opening question, starting with you, Simon, is do you agree with them? There's no money left.
Well, I think, in the end, the fiscal headroom you have is always dependent on the choices that you make. And I absolutely believe that it's important to bring the tax burden that the country faces down. We've seen today that, in particular, the implications of the freeze on the threshold for income tax is equivalent to up to a 6p rise in income tax over the years ahead.
You don't think that's sustainable?
And I don't think that burden of tax is sustainable. I do believe there should be obviously in the onset of the new Parliament next year, a full spending review. And if there is a Conservative government, which I hope there will be, then I believe we should bring the profile of public spending down to create the space to pay for tax cuts.
So you think cutting spending and pre-election...
That has always been my position, that we are simply spending too much as a country and we need to bring that burden of spending down to create credible space. The reason the markets bucked last autumn was that we didn't do that, and that's what we need to do this time.
IFS says that tax cuts would be unsustainable too. You'll inherit this, possibly, Alex, if Labour wins the next election, because the think tank says this would be the case this year and next year. The Labour manifesto is pretty modest. In fact, it's getting more modest as we go on. You admit a Labour government wouldn't be able to do very much either.
We've said very clearly that this is going to take a decade of renewal to clear up the mess that has been left by 13 years of government failure by the Conservatives.
Well, you may not last a decade in that case.
We're just over a year since the disastrous budget from Liz Truss, which has put a mortgage bombshell on homeowners here in the country and left us all reeling. Low growth, high taxes. What is the legacy of a Conservative government? And it just shows that, political choices have made this a reality for millions across the country.
And you admit you won't be able to do very much either with what's left.
We're saying we've got to make difficult choices, but we've got a plan forward to build that renewal for the country. It is going to take time in order to clear up this mess, but we're ready and we've got that plan to deliver.
There's no money left, is there, Munira?
No, well, this research is devastating and just shows the economic vandalism that the Conservatives have subjected our families up and down the country and our economy to. And we know from the Resolution Foundation, your average family is going to be £1,800 worse off over 2 years, a large chunk of that going into tax. And at the same time, our public services are absolutely on the floor.
Well, Simon says cut spending and cut taxes. What would you do?
Well, I'd like to see some of our big multinationals picking up some of the tab. I mean, it was the Liberal Democrats who first suggested the windfall tax, which, whilst has been implemented in part, is full of loopholes.
Would you increase taxes?
Yeah, well, we wouldn't have have cut taxes for banks. And in my own area of education and children, I've said we need better mental health provision for our children, funded by additional taxes on social media giants, who, frankly, are causing a lot of those problems.
Vandalism, economic vandalism is what the Tories...
I'm afraid this simply doesn't meet the seriousness of the situation. Clearly, the country is recovering from two shocks. The first was the pandemic and the second of the Ukraine
And the third, Liz
war.
Truss?
No, well, the truth is, if you look at mortgage rates across the developed world, they are soaring. In fact, rates in the United States are higher than they are here. There is no question whatsoever that what that episode last autumn shows us is that you need to have fiscal credibility with the markets for the plans that you adopt. If you bring the profile of public spending down, and ultimately that, I believe, is what needs to happen, state spending is structurally too high, then you create the space to reduce taxes.
Right. I mean, you were in Liz Truss's cabinet. If what you say is correct, cutting public spending, despite the state of public services and ongoing strikes, why do you think that would be a better economic prospectus?
Well, ultimately, it can't be right that we have the highest burden of taxation in this country since the end of the Second World War. Taxes are ultimately about stifling growth. That is the reality. You cannot tax your way to prosperity. We know, as a society, we are overburdened. Families up and down the country, one of the reasons why life is difficult this autumn is taxes are too high. There is nobody watching this programme who can credibly believe that a Labour or a Liberal administration would do anything to reduce that burden. Well, I think the Conservatives should.
I think we know that. You may be right on that point. Camilla, there's no money left.
I mean, there are some people, aren't there, that already say, oh, well, I'm happy to pay more tax. And you feel like saying to them, well, please be our guest. Go and pay some more.
Well, I think other European countries do take more, some of them in
Exactly, but this is the debate we probably need to have in this country. You know, we can make comparisons to America, where historically their income tax rate has always been a lot lower, but they don't have a welfare state. Are people in this country really happy with high tax and high spend?
Well, I think that's the point, isn't it? Whether we have European levels of taxation and still have American levels of public service and public spending.
Exactly, but equally at the next election, if it is about the economy stupid, to use the Clintonian phrase, is it going to be people looking at their bank balances and saying to themselves, do I feel better off? You know, we hear the statistic this morning that actually wages have risen above inflation. They're 8.1% growth.
Well, as you said that, let's just show everybody the headline in The Independent. Camilla talking about UK wages outstrip inflation for the first time in nearly 2 years.
By, 0.7% higher. But if you said to people, do you feel as if you've been given an 8.1% pay rise, they'll say no. Fiscal drag has been an issue for some years already.
And that's having more people
and also,
in a higher...
people might rightly ask, the IFS has identified that this fiscal drag, dragging people into higher rate tax bands than they would ordinarily have been because they've got pay rises, is going to make the Exchequer 52 billion a year. Well, what are they doing with that money?
Well, do you think Rishi Sunak will get any credit whatsoever for, let's say, reducing inflation, although it is still very high, and growing wages or not?
Well, it depends. He thinks that it is a good sell to the public to say halving inflation is the best tax you can get. And, of course, people want to see prices come down, and it's already quite nice to see our direct debit for our energy bills coming down, following what was a horrific few months during the spring. But at the same time, I think people do feel that the tax burden's too high, that there are far too many people being dragged into that top rate, and that they actually... I mean, I don't know if they agree with economic vandalism. I'm not sure they quite see it like that. I think they've got some understanding about what happened during COVID, but the Tories will never be thanked for giving people money. You know, furlough should have been this great anti-austerity experiment, which was meant to kind of like cloak the Conservatives in virtue, and in fact, they just ended up getting blamed for spending too much money.
Well, just on that point, that's because they also spent too much money giving their friends COVID contracts that didn't come to fruition. They didn't, they spent all this money on unusable PPE. They wasted public money as well. So I don't think the public will thank them for that either.
Briefly.
I mean, if you look at the analysis of this, of course the Exchequer will seek to recover the money that was spent wrongly, but it is a fraction of the total. We were distributing that money at huge speed under unprecedented pressure. And lest we forget, Labour shadow ministers were encouraging us to give money to all sorts of unsuitable organisations during that period. All right. It is simply a fallacy, the idea that we were mugged off because we were negligent.
Let's leave it there and talk about the SNP, because the First Minister, Humza Yousaf, will give his first conference speech as SNP leader in Aberdeen this afternoon. I'll be back with a special programme at 3 o'clock this afternoon, covering his speech live and uninterrupted. erupted. But let's have a look at this headline first in BBC News. Humza Yousaf signals change in independence strategy. Yes, and this is saying that the UK general election, whenever it happens next year, will constitute a mandate for independence negotiations with the UK government, who've so far refused. This is different from the previous idea, which Nicola Sturgeon, his predecessor, was keen on, of treating the election as a de facto referendum. Let's talk to the SNP's deputy leader, Keith Brown. He's there for us in Aberdeen. Welcome to Politics Live. What's the plan exactly, Keith, in terms of the sort of metric, the measure by which you will trigger those negotiations?
A fairly straightforward one, which is if we win the election in Scotland, i.e. we win the most seats at that election, then we will have a mandate to start independence negotiations. Now, it's not a new idea. Margaret Thatcher agreed this way back in the 1980s, that the party, the SNP, if they win the largest majority of seats in Scotland, they have the right to fulfil that mandate for independence. So that will be followed, given what we expect will be the intransigence of the Westminster parties, who all signed up to the fact under the Smith Commission that Scotland should have the right to choose its own future, and they wouldn't stand in the way of that, but are now denying the proper way to do that through a referendum. So that will be followed by a constitutional convention involving Civic Scotland and all those people and parties who agree it's Scotland's right to choose, not necessarily with independence, but the democratic right of Scotland to exercise its right to self-determination.
So you're talking about 29 seats. If the SNP wins 29 seats or more, that would constitute the sort of metric or measure to trigger those negotiations.
Well, it's a simple statement of fact. Under the dysfunctional democracy that we have in the UK, if you win the election, and in Scotland that would mean 29 seats, if you win the election, you have the right to implement your mandate. So that's what we are saying we'll do. Of course, we won't limit our ambitions to that. We'll try and get a majority of votes, I'm sure, as well. We'll try and do as well as we can at that election. But we're having to play by the Westminster rules.
All right, yeah, no, well, fair enough. But those are the rules in place. Those are the rules in place, as you say. If you get fewer, just to clarify for our audience, than 29 seats, is it over? Is the whole question of independence over for a generation, as another politician famously said?
Well, I think people have to understand this. It's not a question that anybody can say independence is off the agenda for a generation. It should be the right of the people of Scotland. In fact, many of the unionist parties have accepted this point. When the people of Scotland want to exercise that right, they should have that right. The people of the Falkland Islands had that right. Other countries around the world have had that right. Many have chosen to leave the UK.
Yeah, I understand, but all I'm trying to establish for our audience is what exactly you are going to do. If you get fewer than 29 seats, you're not going to then ask Westminster, the government, to actually start those negotiations. That's correct, isn't it?
We don't intend to get fewer than 29 seats. We currently have over 40 seats out of the 59 on offer in Scotland. We have a very strong track record.
Well, you have had a strong track record. Whether that continues, we'll have to see. You currently hold 43 seats. What is it about losing a dozen seats that will put you in a stronger position to negotiate for another independence referendum?
I don't know if you realise how preposterous this sounds. So the rationale that you're putting to me is that if a Westminster party, the Labour Party, the Conservative Party, were in government, went into election and won fewer seats but still won the election, they wouldn't have a right to implement that mandate. It's just nonsensical. And the rules cannot keep being changed for Scotland. Just let me finish this point. You cannot keep on saying these are the rules when it doesn't apply to Scotland. We are going to comply with the rules. If we win the game, if we win the election, then of course we have the right to implement that manifesto.
I understand that. And you're right to a certain extent. But what I'm trying to say to you is, how can you, from your current position of strength of 43 seats, where you failed to persuade, rightly or wrongly, but you failed to persuade Conservative governments to hold those negotiations? They've said no. The other Unionist Party, the Labour Party, have said no. What is it that makes you think that they will suddenly open negotiations if you have fewer seats? You've lost the Rutherglen and Hamilton by-election. You've had a defection to the Conservative. Well, hang on, let me finish it, and then you can say what you want to say. It doesn't look as if you're a party in a position of strength trying to negotiate a major constitutional change. If you haven't done it up until now, what on earth makes you think you'll be able to get your way in a weaker position?
Well, first of all, we are the government in Scotland. We have, along with our Greens, a majority, an absolute majority in the Scottish Parliament. We have the vast majority of seats at Westminster, not reflected in the media coverage on programmes like this. I appreciate that fact, normally allocated to the third party. So I understand that, but we're in a very strong position currently. We intend to maintain that position. But the idea that we could not say to the UK, the idea that you've said it's a failure on the part of the SNP, because the Labour Party and the Tory Party have set their face against their previous commitment and set their face against democracy. They should be being confronted with this question. That's their failure to recognise democratic legitimacy.
I take that point, but my point is, why will they listen to you? What is it that's going to change their mind? It's not a criticism directly of you, it's just that they are not listening to you. Why should they listen to you if you're in a slightly worse position?
I understand that point, because they have been completely intransigent, gone back in the previous commitments. Well, so if you look at the totality of what the strategy is that was agreed yesterday, we will now have a constitutional convention, regardless of the response from Westminster, to take forward that. That happened previously, of course, prior to devolution. We will take forward that constitutional convention with broader Scotland to make sure that we can put the maximum pressure, and we have to take control back to Scotland. That's what self-determination means, not waiting for somebody else to give you permission to do that. And can I just come back before we conclude on the points that we've heard already? The prospect in Scotland is for people to have the Tories, massive debt, the highest ever debt, the highest taxes since the Second World War, high inflation, people really suffering. And Labour, who left the last government saying there was no money left, now saying that before they go into the next election. So the prospects under the UK are so bad, not just for people in Scotland, I appreciate, for across the UK, that the best opportunity for them is independence for Scotland.
But just to underline the point that you can't get there unless the UK government at Westminster says so, which may be, and you obviously think that is wrong, but that is still currently the case. Nicola Sturgeon's idea was to sort of make the general election a de facto referendum. Why have you moved away from that?
Well, we had the arguments. We had a fantastic debate, a very open debate, unlike previous party conferences that I've seen over the last few weeks, where all strands of opinion were put. And the conclusion of the conference supported the proposal from the party leader, Hamza Yousaf, that we should make sure that we apply the same rules that we are being told to comply with, which is if you win the election, if you get a majority of seats, then you have the right to implement your mandate. Now, you're right to say there's an intransigence on the UK government, but there are other folk. There are international organisations which look towards the UK that wants to be apparently a bastion of democracy. So the pressure that will grow on the UK if they continue to deny democracy is where we can see a real movement. And if we ally that to the broader people of Scotland through the Constitutional Convention, I think that will be unstoppable in making sure that we achieve our independence.
Keith Brown, we have politicians here in the studio. I'll keep you there just so you can respond and listen to what they have to say. A majority of seats would constitute a trigger for mandate negotiations with the UK government, whoever that is at the time. Do you accept that support is still, broadly speaking, 50-50 for independence? So despite the problems that the SNP have had with a police investigation into their finances, Nicola Sturgeon has stepped down, who'd been seen as the best leader in UK politics for some time, and a loss of the by-election, and still 50% of people in Scotland would like to see independence.
I'm afraid that what we've heard there is a strategy of desperation, with the goalposts moving so loudly you can almost hear it in the background. So the SNP were saying that they wanted to get a majority of the votes. They've now shifted that to 29 seats. I simply do not see, in all credibility, how you can say that if they move from having won 48 seats, and of course having lost Rutherglen, having had a defection to the Conservatives just a few days ago, against that backdrop of absolute chaos and with their fortunes disintegrating, to say that winning 29 seats would constitute a new mandate.
But still 50-50 support for independence
is simply not true. We had a referendum in 2014 on this question. I think most people in Scotland would be horrified at the prospect of reopening this toxic question just a decade after we had what was meant to be a once-in-a-generation event. And there is simply no way on earth that a Conservative government would regard the SNP losing a load of seats as a mandate for them to get another referendum.
No way on earth for you, Alex, too, and the Labour Party, and a Labour government if you win?
We're seeing, yet again, the SNP moving the goalposts, as Simon says, in terms of how they determine the constitutional future of Scotland and the United Kingdom, whereas I'd like to see them put that effort into actually helping the people of Scotland face some of the massive challenges that people are facing in terms of a cost of living crisis, NHS waiting times in Scotland, you know, in crisis, looking at how we can actually help people on the ground rather than obsessing over the constitutional future, which has been already debated, has been discussed. I mean, the only real change for the people of Scotland is electing a Labour government, as we saw with them choosing to vote for us in Rutherglen and Hamilton recently.
Right. I mean, Keith, losing a bunch of seats won't constitute a mandate for negotiations. What do you say in response to both Simon and Alex? And I'll come to you.
Well, first of all, just as I've said, it's ludicrous. When I see them apply that to any Labour or Tory government that still retains a majority of seats, but less than before, disallowing them to carry out their manifesto, then I believe it. But the irony of the Labour and Tory parties saying we are moving the goalposts, when they agreed under the Smith Commission, they signed under the Smith Commission, nothing should prevent the people of Scotland moving towards independence if that's what they choose. They're the ones that are changing the goalposts. And of course, the goalposts are the ones set for success, the barometer of success at Westminster. They are, if you win a majority of seats, you have the right to have that mandate. But to hear from the Labour Party, having a go at the NHS in Scotland, giving the appalling state of the NHS in Wales, we all know that all NHS services, in fact, all countries' health services have had to deal with the pandemic. But in Scotland, the NHS is the best performing health service in the UK, and that includes the badly performing NHS in Wales.
All right.
So Labour are no answer to the interests of the people of Scotland.
Let me just come back to Simon. What's your response to the constitutional point, firstly?
Well, the reality is that the threshold for a second referendum within a decade on tearing apart our country needs to be higher than the governing party of Scotland.
But you said no, even when it was higher and has been higher.
Well, we had a referendum in 2014, literally 10 years ago next autumn, which is the maximum extent of this Parliament. We had a referendum on that question, and we settled this question.
Continually won majorities, big majorities.
And that support is now imploding, and we're going to see that, I'm afraid, next year. And that is why this strategy is being dreamt up, because they know they will not obtain the support of a majority of Scots. They won't come close to doing so. They'll probably get about a third of the Scottish electorate. That is not a mandate for a second referendum.
Munira?
Well, I think this argument is absurd, as you pointed out, Jo, that SNP think that they could lose seats at the next general election and that gives them a mandate to negotiate another independence referendum. I think when I talk to my Scottish colleagues, when they're out knocking on doors, they say this is not the priority for voters. It is a total distraction, this constant focus on independence, when actually what most Scottish voters want is a focus on the cost of living, crisis in our NHS, sewage in our rivers and seas, and schools that should be performing better and are crumbling. That is what most Scottish people want to see their government focus on, not this constant focus on independence.
Can I just show everybody, including, I know, Keith, you can't see it, but I'll read you the headline. The Scottish Daily Mail, it says, Sturgeon steals the limelight. You will have seen Nicola Sturgeon in the headlines. Humza overshadowed as ex-First Minister wows SNP conference, but at least she backs him for ripping up her independence plan. Do you think she did steal the limelight, Camilla?
Well, almost by design, but I think that's because there isn't the confidence in Yousaf that there was in her. And I think you did point to the fact that she did have good leadership qualities, that she did have a huge amount of charisma, and that she was the kind of figurehead for the independence movement. And I think, actually, you know, it's unfortunate, isn't it? This nickname, you know, Humza Useless, has kind of taken hold. I think that support for the SNP is imploding. I agree with Munira that I don't think it's a priority for the Scottish people. Also, you know, a lifetime isn't 10 years, is it? A lifetime isn't a decade. I think if you give a once-in-a-lifetime referendum, most people think that's, what, half a century at a bare minimum?
Well, we can negotiate that, I suppose, another point. But, Keith, on Nicola Sturgeon stealing the limelight, I mean, it's a sticky wicket, isn't it, for Humza Yousaf?
No, I think especially given the last weeks with what's happened in the Middle East, Hamza Yousaf is really starting to get a profile which is necessary to be leader of the SNP in terms of the way he's led international opinion on his response, of course informed by his own personal family circumstances. And of course, if you think back to when Nicola Sturgeon first became leader of the SNP's First Minister, of course you've got to move beyond the influence of your predecessor. But Nicola Sturgeon was an outstanding politician, outstanding leader of the SNP. Just to say, I'm glad that we've got unanimity amongst all the UK parties that are there. None of them have mentioned the point that you've mentioned. 50% at least of people in Scotland support independence. And the reason they won't refer to that is because that's the real basis of Scotland's demand for independence. People want it. And the idea that the SNP, I've heard you all say it, the SNP support is imploding. After 16 years, we still lead the polls for Westminster and for the Scottish parliamentary elections.
I'm glad you brought that.
The most trusted party in Scotland.
Well, as you've raised that, conveniently, we have a graph to show precisely your point, Keith. You can see in the Scottish Parliament election polls we're talking about, you can see in a year the SNP support has dropped 10% from 47 to 37%. But Keith is absolutely right. They are ahead, the SNP, of the other major parties. Labour has increased a bit. The Conservatives and Liberal Democrats have flatlined. I mean, if you can't capitalise, Simon, on the basis of all of the woes that we have listed for the SNP, you know, you're not striking a chord with Scottish voters at all, are you?
Well, the reality is, of course, that support for unionism in Scotland is split three ways, and that is what these polls fail to reflect. The unionist cause in Scotland is strong. I think
you flatlined in a year.
I think that the reality is that the Scottish Conservative Party has performed pretty resiliently, and the defection of Lisa Cameron to us just last week, citing the toxicity of the political culture of the SNP, reflects, I think, the exhaustion that Scotland feels with this party hell-bent on division, obsessed with it to the exclusion of all the other social and economic issues facing Scotland. It is not healthy. There is no mandate for it. It is not going to happen.
I mean, Alex, are you expecting to win the next Scottish parliamentary elections?
We are going to fight every single seat.
Now, are you expecting to win?
We are offering people of Scotland the change that they want. I mean, I'm not going to predict what we're going to do.
Why aren't you ambitious enough to say, we'll beat the SNP, we'll go first?
We just beat them in Rutherglen and Hamilton West.
Yes.
We won that seat back.
Yes.
You know, that shows that the people of Scotland are crying out for change. They are being failed by two governments at the moment, and I think that was very much apparent when I was knocking doors, talking to voters up there in Scotland about what they want to see and what they want changed. It is time for change, and I think only a Labour Party can beat the Conservatives up there and the SNP, as we've just shown, in order to deliver it.
Why only 6% for the Liberal Democrats, despite all of the massive problems the party has been going through? The SNP, that is, not the Liberal Democrats.
Well, if we actually look at election results rather than polls, at the last local elections of all the opposition parties, the Liberal Democrats gained the most seats at council elections. And so when Scottish voters see Liberal Democrats actually doing great things in their local communities, they are going out and voting for us.
Keith, final word ahead of our special programme later on this afternoon covering Hamza Yousaf's speech. Keith? Oh, have we
Sorry,
lost?
sorry, I didn't catch that.
It is. Keith, it was to you to have a final word before we let you go, and I was just trailing our special programme this afternoon to cover Hamza Yousaf's speech.
Well, very much looking forward to it. Of course, you mentioned the strategy which we agreed yesterday in a tremendous debate, the likes of which you will not see in other parties. And just to reiterate the point, he will deliver that speech against the backdrop of the SNP still being the most popular party in Scotland. In relation to the Liberal Democrats, who I think have 4 MSPs in the Scottish Parliament, it was the SNP that won more seats than anybody else at the local elections just a couple of years ago. And if Labour can't even put their ambitions to win the election, just to remind you, talking about polls, in 2011, 2 months before the election in 2011, Labour were 15 points ahead in the polls. The SNP broke the system and won 69 out of 129 seats. And I think the reason for that, I genuinely believe the reason for that, is that the only party that will always speak up just for Scotland is not the Labour Party, who will be told what to do by Keir Starmer, and not the Tory Party. And that's why I'm confident of continued electoral success from the SNP. And I think that's what we hear from the First Minister this afternoon.
Keith Brown, Deputy Leader of the SNP, thank you very much for joining us. Let's talk about housing. BBC Two has a new documentary. It's called Britain's Housing Crisis, What Went Wrong. It takes a long view, the documentary, looking at various policy failures that have led to inflated house prices over the last few decades. Let's hear from 2 senior Tories or former senior Tories in this clip.
The central problem is we have too many people that don't want new housing in their backyard, in their neighbourhood, because they feel it will affect their house price or that it's going to spoil their view, and that is what motivates them more than thinking about the next generation.
I think that the difficulty that the Conservative Party has is that it weighs up against each other. On the one hand, the people that they know vote for them, who live in agreeable houses with views of green fields and who might be members of the local Conservative Association, and then a theoretical group of people who are in their 20s and 30s. They have no idea how they vote. They rather suspect that they probably don't vote Conservative. I have reached a conclusion, which is that the Conservative Party is never going to do what is necessary to meet the housing needs of the British people.
Do you agree with Sajid Javid and Nick Bowles, Simon, that the Conservative Party is never going to tackle the housing crisis?
No, I don't, because that's the reason why I'm a Conservative MP. I am determined that we as a party should tackle this fundamental challenge, which they both spelt out, about making sure that we are on the side of people who legitimately aspire to a good home of their own or an affordable rented property, rather than people who have that. And I don't believe that is an absolute trade-off. I think that this country has more than enough land to satisfy both communities. We need to be building well to a high standard, and we need to be building ambitiously in the places that need that growth.
Right, but you haven't done it up until now. And 13 years of Conservative. You must be one of the most disappointed members of your party. You've been a member of the government, that they have not listened to you on this issue of housing.
I think there are two things. So the first is not to actually underplay how housing starts haven't been as bad as are perhaps sometimes widely categorised. It's just that they, as a level of ambition, need to go up a notch again. And I do believe that we need to be talking more in the region of 300,000 to 500,000 starts a year if we are to bear down on the shortfall of some 4 million homes, which the Centre for Cities assesses that we have. This is a really difficult and sensitive issue because, of course, people living in communities want to make sure that they don't get blighted by loads of houses being dropped in a field with no infrastructure and no care for the quality of those products. But we can do this in a way which doesn't create those problems.
Do you accept Rishi Sunak's not really that interested in the whole issue of house building, however transformative it might be? He's not interested. He didn't mention it in his conference speech. He watered down housing targets, which you disagree with. You said it was a major, major mistake.
I'm on record with my views on housing targets, but of course what the government has done in recent weeks, and it does deserve credit, is try to unlock the problem of nutrient neutrality. So this is blocking 100,000 homes.
That sort of watering down to quite
very apt phrase. So this relates to the fact that rules set by Natural England are being interpreted, thanks to a legacy EU ruling, to mean that 100,000 homes, where planning permission has been granted, are being blocked by the regulators. This is to say they cannot be brought forward, even though the permission exists, even though the new homes wouldn't be the cause of water pollution. We brought that forward in the Levelling Up bill, which is currently going through the House. Labour, despite all the rhetoric, voted against it.
Right, well, let Alex come back on that. In fact, we've got the headline, BBC News, Lord Sink plan. It was Labour Lord Sink plan to axe home building pollution rules, which Simon is talking about. And I'll come back to Simon on Sir Keir Starmer. But what do you say?
We don't need to destroy our rivers and our environment in order to build new homes. There is another way. And as you've said, 13 years of failure to actually build these homes. The Prime Minister is currently at the whim of his backbenchers, prevented from actually pushing forward with this regeneration of house building that we desperately need in the country. And it's shocking, it's appalling, and we do need to start building these homes. We've got a plan. The Labour Party has a plan to build these new homes. We want to get on and deliver it.
Do you agree with that plan? I mean, they have got a plan, the Labour Party. They set it out very clearly. Delivery is another thing, but they have got a plan.
Well, Liberal Democrats have said that actually one of the key things to trying to unlock the parlous situation in the housing market is actually building more social homes. That's an area that actually both national and local government have got control over. And we've said, as opposed to the 8,000 social homes we saw built here last year, that we need a target of 150,000 social homes, because we know that actually the lack of social housing, and I see it in my own constituency with huge waiting lists, is driving up rents, and it makes it impossible affordable for people to then be able to save a deposit and get on the housing ladder.
But your party tried, or the leadership tried to shelve the housing target that you had. You had the most ambitious, I think, housing target of 380,000 a year.
Yeah.
You tried to shelve that, and your membership, because you're the only party that actually takes on conference motions that are passed by the members, have forced you to keep it.
And I'm proud that we're a democratic party, and we had a really brilliant
so you
debate.
were wrong in the first instance.
No. We had a brilliant debate, and I was there in the conference hall listening to every word. I don't personally think that the big housing target will necessarily mean those homes are delivered. The reason why we focus on the social housing target is because that is an area where national and local government can make a difference, and actually local authorities need to be given the powers and the funding to be able to build those social homes. And if you look at Liberal Democrat councils up and down the country, they are building social homes, whether that's in the Lake District, whether that's in Eastleigh, whether that's in Kingston. We see this time and again.
Yeah, but not enough. I mean, Camilla, does any party really have the sort of strategy that you can believe will be delivered? Labour's Keir Starmer did set out a very clear plan, or certainly a commitment, an ambition to actually deliver. Do you believe him?
Well, I think the public looks at successive failures of governments on this issue, and we can tell why it's happened and why the numbers are so stretched. A combination of factors: not building enough council homes to replace those that were sold under Thatcher and the Tories initially. Increased prevalence of family breakdown, which means that families then have to adopt 2 different houses. And third of all, net migration being predicted to be 250,000 per year by the IFS. I know people can't talk about immigration and its impact on housing because there are some people on the left who seem to perceive that as some kind of blame game. It's not a blame game, it's just a fact. If you're going to accommodate 250,000 people into this country every year for the next decade, you've got to build the houses to accommodate them physically. You know, it's interesting because you might see Tory graph readers as being rather NIMBY and not YIMBY.
But do you think Sir Keir Starmer is more likely to deliver? I mean, he says build,
Possibly,
build.
But I was just going to say about the mood of the nation, because I think we sometimes ascribe 1980s and 90s views to Conservatives that they no longer have, because I think Conservatives are becoming more YIMBY than NIMBY, because they're increasing...
Yes, in my backyard.
OK, obviously, there's nobody wants to be concreting over the countryside. But, of course, there are Conservative voters that are concerned that their children and their grandchildren can't live anywhere near them anymore.
Well, another concern is this, Simon, as the former Housing Secretary. BBC News charities concerned over lack of progress with Renters Reform Bill. Now, I mean, it was introduced, had its first reading, I think, in May or June. It's stalled, hasn't it? And it's going to include the idea of no-fault evictions. Are you worried it's just not going to make it at all onto the statute book?
Well, I think we are going to see, obviously, the King's Speech in the next few weeks, and I would strongly expect the Renters Reform Bill to come as an integral part of that, and indeed to take on some of the big issues which we also need to address, like leasehold reform as well. We need to create a housing settlement in this country. So they're going to have to start
all over again?
Ultimately, I think probably we are now looking at
it's
this being the new bill for the new session.
It's already been introduced to Parliament. You've been struggling to fill the business for Parliament, both before recess and after recess. Why couldn't we have had second reading and gone into committee stage? This is a much-needed reform that renters up and down the country are crying out for.
Well, look, I mean, you know my views on the need for urgent progress on housing. I strongly support this being included in the King's Speech. I think it is absolutely vital that this country has a frank and honest conversation in a way which has not happened for too long about the fact that we are not building enough homes where we need to build them, that our planning system is utterly sclerotic and is grossly distorted by NIMBY communities up and down this country. We need to break that wide open so that we can give people the dignity and security that a home of their own allows.
And Rishi Sunak will end no-fault evictions. It was a manifesto promise.
And that is Conservative Party policy, and that is what will be in this bill, which will come forward, I'm sure, in the King's Speech.
Alex, you're looking sceptical.
Well, it's not worth the paper it's written on. You've seen plethora of manifesto commitments be absolutely dropped throughout the course of this Parliament. The fact that we haven't had this come back as a bill, the fact that we haven't built these houses, as I've said, it just shows that a lack of leadership, a lack of political will to do this.
I'm going to have to move on because we want to talk about Brexit briefly at the end of the programme. Let me just show you this headline, if we can. Brexit Brexit, it says, call us on trade, says German Finance Minister Christian Lindner. We heard him at the top of the programme. Should Rishi Sunak pick up the phone to the EU?
The last thing we should do is reopen the conversation over a trade relationship with the European Union. And the main reason for that is we know, after exhaustive exploration of this, that any closer trade deal would involve either single market or customs union membership or both. That means, for example, if it's single market membership, shelving our ability to have our own immigration policy. If it's customs union membership, it means killing off our new free ports and trade deals. There is no closer relationship which doesn't involve basically becoming either a full or a shadow member of the EU.
Do you agree with that, Alex? I mean, Sir Keir Starmer wants a closer relationship. Is that what he's going to have to do?
We have been very clear as the Labour Party that we have our red lines. That does not mean returning to the customs union. That does not mean returning to the single market. That does not mean returning to free movement. Nevertheless, we need to be having conversations about making Brexit actually work for the people of this country, because it's currently not. You're seeing businesses having to deal with so much red tape, food stuck on lorries, not being able to get on people's table quicker and cheaper for people. It's causing a numerous amount of issues, and we have been clear that we would renegotiate, looking at in terms of veterinary agreements, looking at how we manage professional services moving freer across the EU. This is something that we need to discuss, but we've been very clear on our red lines. No customs union, no free movement, no single market.
Well, there you go. What have you got to worry about?
Well, believe you me, those are empty words, because there is no closer relationship to be had. Of course, you might be able to achieve some stuff at the margin, and that's helpful in a number of regards. And the government obviously is open to that too. But a substantive renegotiation of the Brexit deal is not up there for agreement without compromising a whole basis on which this country voted to leave in the first place.
The Lib Dems would like to join the single market at some point.
Well, we've set out very clearly our four-stage roadmap to rebuild our relationship with the European Union, starting with schemes like Erasmus Plus and looking at trying to cut some of the red tape that is really impacting our businesses, our farmers and fishermen, with ultimately being able to rebuild those bonds of friendship and trust to be able to consider joining the single market ultimately. We've always said that we are passionate pro-Europeans. We see our future at the heart of Europe. We can see the damage that Brexit is doing to our economy. And if the Germans are up for negotiating a better arrangement, it just shows you that actually a better deal probably could have been had rather than Boris Johnson's botched Brexit deal. And Labour, frankly, are all over the place with it because they voted for it, let's not forget.
I'm just confused about what is at the moment particularly economically attractive about the EU. Stagnant growth rates, worse than ours. So this whole talk of we'd fall off a cliff while the EU prospered into the distance simply hasn't materialised.
We'd be able to
for the
trade
Lib Dems as well, probably concern about the likes of right-wing parties like the AfD nipping at Olaf Scholz's heels, sovereign debt at an all-time high, a central bank with no reserves. I mean, it's not exactly an attractive economic offering, is it? No wonder there's been some focus on countries that are growing more for us to do deals with. Because the EU is a bit of a busted flush. I know the Lib Dems don't want to admit to it.
The Australian trade deal over the long term will add 0.08% to our economy, while we lose about 4% thanks to Europe.
Disputed by Kemi
Thanks to leaving the European Union.
In answer to your question, is the EU looking economically robust at the moment?
Camilla, just last week I had a conversation with a constituent who has set up his own business recently, a fintech business, and he is struggling so much here. He's considering relocating the entire business to Portugal or somewhere else in the European Union. It's the smaller businesses in particular that are really struggling with the bureaucracy that Brexit has brought upon our country.
I think they're probably struggling with ultra-high tax rates.
I mean, do you accept that they're not performing well economically as a Eurozone or individual countries, some of them?
Well, they have their own challenges as well, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we couldn't thrive. The fact is we could do even better if we were in the European Union.
Perhaps, Simon, the fact that the finance minister has said call us means they need us maybe more than we need them.
Well, ultimately, we want to have a good relationship with everybody. But the United Kingdom is outward-looking. We've always been a global presence, and I would much rather be making our future bets on our membership, for example, of the CPTPP, the Pacific Trade Bloc, or indeed negotiating a new trade deal with India, than I would be on trying to do deals with what are stagnating and ultimately declining economies in Western Europe.
Yes, but you do accept that there have been, since that Brexit agreement, significant problems with trade, with the EU. There's been trade friction.
We left the European Union. There was always going to be a trade-off to leaving the European Union. And ultimately,
according to the OBR analysis in November 2022, it has had a significant adverse effect on UK trade.
There is no question that the gruesome threats that were hurled against those of us who voted to leave the European Union have simply not materialised in terms of the nature of our trading relationship with the EU. It's vital that the UK thinks, acts globally and moves forward on that basis.
So Rishi Sunak shouldn't pick up the phone. That's all for now. Thank you to all of my guests for today. I'll be back, as I've said a few times, at 3 o'clock to bring coverage and analysis of Humza Yousaf's speech to the SNP conference. So do join me then. From all of us here, bye-bye.
All around the